different and varied images in our minds, which will reflect our own personal experiences as well as other ministers' family lives we may have observed. So I would like to start by naming the challenges many female ministers face before turning to redemptive and life-giving ways which may help us tackle those challenges. Let's start then with the fact that a minister's family life, whatever its shape, will often seem to be everybody's business. And if the minister is female, then unsolicited advice will be offered and very personal questions will often be asked. Let's start with a single minister. On the one hand, her reasons for being or becoming single might be a point of constant discussion. On the other hand, particularly if she doesn't have children or other dependents, then she might find that she's considered to be free and available for the congregation's needs at any time of day or night. She doesn't have family life, you see, and so obviously can be completely devoted to her ministry. For those who are married but without children, the story is likely to be somewhat different, because our culture often assumes that the couple's relationship will be the most important relationship in any human's life. There will be some respect for their time as a couple, though there may be an expectation that the spouse will take up some of the supporting duties related to ministry. The fact that they do not have children, however, can mean that at times they are not considered to be a real family with a real family life. And then a minister who is married and with children will have a different set of challenges to tackle. Namely, her spouse and children will often be expected to represent the ideal nuclear family model in all kinds of aspects of their appearance, behavior, and choices. Quite a burden. And for the minister herself, she will likely feel the pressure of being both a perfect pastor and a perfect wife/mother. An impossible challenge she knows she'll fail time and again. Again, as with singleness or childlessness, these expectations and pressures are well familiar to all kinds of women. But for a minister, they form a particular kind of a tension between her pastoral role and what she feels is essential for her own well-being and flourishing. So it's no wonder then that ministers will often seek to build a clear wall, at times a wall with barbed wire, between the privacy of their family life and ministry. It may often seem to be the only way of surviving. And after all, this is the model that has been upheld in our culture since the wake of the Industrial Revolution, when family life became increasingly understood in romantic and emotional terms, with family and its home treated as a shelter from the challenges of this world. This is the worldview under the power of which we still largely live. So this is what I'd like to suggest is at the heart of our theme tonight. Our theology, which places nuclear family in whatever shape or form at the center of our lives, or at least right after our personal relationship with God. God, family, then church is the order of priorities I was taught as a young girl, Christian girl. Perhaps you were too. The trouble is, it doesn't really reflect what we find in the witness of the New Testament, which rather portrays church as one's primary family. Yes, there are blood links and familial relationships, but they all fit within Jesus's vision of this new kind of a family. You know, these are my brothers and my sisters and my mother. Following Jesus and welcoming the inbreaking kingdom of God must be worth the price of reordering all earthly relationships. And so in the early pages of our Christian story, although at times entire households committed to the way of Jesus, for many early Christians, their allegiance to Jesus meant leaving their previous identity and economic security and joining an alternative support system, a new order family called the church. Not that the Roman society thought this was a good idea. Such Christian practices were seen as an affront to existing family patterns, and Christians were being accused of destroying the very foundations of a good and orderly society. One of the starkest examples of this was a number of Christian women who chose very actively and very unusually for their times to remain unmarried. Of course, many Christians still married, but the practice of celibacy in those early days embodied the Christian conviction that the kingdom of God was already here, even if not fully. Being free of marriage meant they could live already in the new age ushered by the God of Jesus. As for those who were married, having children was no longer the key element of what it meant to live in God's will, or how faith was to be passed on, or how death was to be overcome. It is a beautiful, if demanding, vision, isn't it? And I'm also very aware how many of us find such vision pretty much impossible in our own communities of faith. Although we might still refer to each other as brothers and sisters, the sense of belonging to this community, having a life together beyond Sunday morning, may be very feeble indeed. No wonder then that in such circumstances, our understanding of family life turns inward to some sort of a home life and a circle of support which can provide us with a sense of being loved, protected, and understood. And some of it is absolutely right as a reaction against the abuse of boundaries we named earlier, the expectation of the constant availability of a single minister, the juggling of family and pastoral roles of a married one, and so on. But I want to suggest that for Christian ministers, the answer does not lie in a successful separation of their belonging to a church community and their family life. And that is true both of single and coupled ministers, because all of us need that larger communal support, or to use Jesus's language, to have church for family. By the way, we should also acknowledge the difficulties involved in calling church a family, when we know that families can be dysfunctional, dangerous, toxic places. But that would be for another talk. And I'm not suggesting it's easy. It will be messy, and it will most certainly be painful at times. But there is something about the call of Jesus that asks us to take up this invitation. So how do we start? The details will be for all of us to figure out. But for starters, I'd like to suggest we look at the practice of friendship, an often overlooked practice in our day and age. This is often a tricky area for ministers. They're not supposed to have close friends within the congregation, right? On that personal level, we will have to figure out ways of cultivating friendships within and out with our own church, so that these friends can become part of our own family life in the way this phrase is typically understood. But I think we should go further. We are also invited into friendship understood not only in personal or intimate terms, but also as a community building and hospitable missional practice to which we are invited as the friends of Jesus, the one who called his disciples friends and the one who was known as the friend of sinners. So what might family life mean for a minister? It will surely take different forms depending on our particular life circumstances, but it will have to be something that is open towards others. That's where we'll find nourishment, support, as well as surely a great deal of challenge.
It is perhaps foolish to unpick the arguments for your own existence, but trusting that I won't promptly vanish into a puff of logic, I decided in my MTH thesis to deconstruct the different arguments that we have for women in ministry in the Baptist Union of Great Britain, not against, those that are written for. I took a 30-year time frame and undertook what is I described as a textual analysis of everything written by a Baptist Union author or commissioned within or by the Union that argued that women should be ordained, in order to understand exactly what they were arguing for when they were arguing for women in ministry. And what I found there surprised me. I discovered that we had moved from the conservative position of what has been known as complementarity, that there is this ontological difference between men and women, and that these binary pairs have been created by God and are sustained in the church, that men have public headship roles, including preaching and teaching, where women have the private, domestic, and subservient roles. The argument we used for women's ministry has been a clever twist on this, arguing that it was precisely because women were different to men through their gifts and collaborative styles that we needed them in ministry. This male and female partnership is imaged in God, and as such, equal representation of this is needed in our church leadership. Due to the reliance upon complementarian theology that continued to run through this position, I named this idea soft complementarity. The presumed consequences of this position were severalfold, including a deep resistance to women who ministered or dressed like men in ministry, the need for women to fix the patriarchal structures for men. They were needed to come and solve the problems. And then the telos of having male and female partnership or co-ministries, as opposed to a woman or a man in sole pastorate. The applications for this in family life for the minister are numerous and perhaps obvious, but let us linger upon them for a moment. If men and women function as binary pairs in creation and are representative of this image of God, the same argument that has been historically used for male and female marriage in our church has also been used for women's ministry. It is a fundamentally heteronormative one. I would offer the critical reflection that a theology that still uses the master's tools, even if we try to use them differently, may end up building a similarly patriarchal structure. We find the anecdotal reflection, let's call it ethnographical for now, that women do not get far in ministry because before being asked whether our husband is also a minister, presuming all sorts of things, namely the presence of a husband in the first place. I worry that we have created an ordained minister's spouse, which gives little room for those who are single or those who are gay, and which, when under pressure, may default to type patriarchal headship and gendered public-private roles. I find no surprise that whilst churches can register for same-sex marriage, our ministers cannot yet enter into those covenants. Developing my earlier position, I now add a third nuance that I think appears in our texts, one which still uses the language of ontological male and female, but which more explicitly tries to decouple this from our biological sex, a position that would be found, for example, in Paul Fide's drawing on Rosemary Radford Ruther. He argues that there is a male way of being and a female way of being that's not based on biological essentialism or the gender or gifts of the gifts or the characteristics themselves, but some way of patterning them, which can be felt rather than documented and must be allowed to work out in practice. Any distinctive male and female functions will lie somewhere in the midst of a range of characteristics in different proportions in men and women. And I think, however, that the essentializing, to move the essentializing of male and female from sex into abstracted but ontological concepts of gender has problems. The ultimate male and female identity is found in God, and this, I am unsure, creates much space for gender fluidity or a critique of any gender stereotypes. Anything that is divinely ratified, we note, becomes much harder for us to question. So maintaining that the difference must be allowed to be worked out rather than described is to ignore the practice, is something that engenders us in turn. it is our experience in the world that also shapes how we live out what it is to be gendered. This could be put down to human fallenness, yet the church has not been yet known for its radical reconfigurations of female and male roles amongst those who have been baptized. I think Fides, whilst he tries to hold both ontological gender in the Godhead and a wider view of complementarity in humanity, misses the role of the sexed human body in how a person's permittable identity and personhood is created both in society and the church. Why does this matter, you may think, for women in family life, in ministry? Well, Goldborn helpfully refers to the concept of third space that women in evangelical ministry have often found themselves, that they become public ministers to the private domestic sphere of family life. I'm interested that our deaconesses in our history who thought differently of their own ordination were nevertheless asked to move off the list upon marriage. That a public ministry to the private family had to end when they developed new private family ties of their own, a presumption that wifely and perhaps motherly duties use the same and presumably finite part of a woman that our public ministry is exercised out of. Now, we have many an example of feminist texts that have in fact tried to work together motherhood and ministry as arguing that they are one and the same. However, I am nervous of this. And so I find myself looking at the impact of motherhood in ministry. I'm nervous of imposing another binary pair on motherhood of mum and not mum. Let us resist that for now and borrow Caroline Gattrell's description of the maternal body as inclusive of the ways in which women are allocated social roles in relation to their actual potential or non-maternity. Thus, the notion of the maternal body is extended to include menstruation, non-motherhood, and menopause. We may recognise the indiscriminate daffodils passed to all women on Mothering Sunday at church. The Mothering Church's function is embodied particularly in one type of sexed body. However, there is a reality to the practical challenge of the caring work of motherhood alongside ministerial commitment. And this is too brought out in our theological work. Helen Collins' research into the place of new mothers in evangelical charismatic churches show that new mothers often feel that they are failing spiritually, that they need to work harder, pray harder, try harder to connect with the worship, but find themselves unable to do this with the tasks of motherhood. In fact, the physical presence of a child who is noisy and disruptive, and find themselves sitting at the back of a church, a space connected in, she argues, with those who are not fully committed to Christ. To become a mother is to be moved from the center of worship to the edge. And in ministry, this is particularly observed as an acute crisis. There are many studies of mothers in ministry, but if we observe just two briefly. In one key Anglican theology on motherhood and priesthood, the link is drawn about how fatherhood is reinforced in priestly fatherhood, where motherhood negates it. The study picked up that the only way to navigate society's intensive views of motherhood when in ministry was to boundary it, that women automatically did this by part-time ministry, chaplaincy, or arriving after kids had gone to secondary school. And in a recent piece of practical theology on female ministers in Church of Ireland, Purser and O'Brien pick up on how the work-family conflict experienced in secular society is intensified in ministry. The competing devotions to work and to family are intensified by the perceived double vocation of women to ministry and motherhood. That mothering and ministry both require 100% attention and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week availability. The Church of Ireland is asked by them to reconsider its gendered patterns of parenting and in order to retain its women in ministry and to see some structural transformation. And so we find arguments in our sibling denominations that women's experience of motherhood in ministry often seems to negate and deplete ministry, where fatherhood is seen to intensify a kind of priestly fatherhood. And I want to suggest to you today, and I don't have time to develop this fully, that this is because we are theologically still driven by a pronatalist view of women in our salvation. We might think of women being saved through childbirth, but I think it appears more subtly and more quietly in our constant language about self-sacrifice too. And I want to quote Monica Coleman, who argues that to be Christ-like is to suffer, to sacrifice, and otherwise endure a loss of self that is already too central in the ways that women are socialized. One final point, we must hear too the womanist critique on working motherhood being experienced differently, that Black women's oppression has been through the lens of surrogacy, both through involuntary surrogacy and slavery, where Black women were forced to bear children for a slave market economy. And then also in the postbellum period, as women, Black women cared for other people's children. To choose to work and to separate motherhood and ministry also asks other people to care for our children, and potentially we might note, for those of us who are white women, mothers in ministry creates situations of significant oppression. To cite Coleman again, for African American women, motherhood has almost always meant a working motherhood, and working has often meant some kind of mothering. So we find ourselves needing to do the theological work to connect again, as Coleman does, with perhaps other stories of women in scripture who have different experiences of motherhood in their ministry. Perhaps the story of Hagar is the place to realize we might find the God who sees. And as well as doing the theological work on how we narrate salvation, we also need to think through the practicalities of the double bind that we place women in. That on the one hand, we want to resist narratives around motherhood and saying that not all women's bodies must be understood in this precise view, but also that we have the challenge of those women who are in motherhood finding themselves in this crisis and potentially conflicting situation where motherhood is seen to negate from their ministry.
Thanks very much, Beth. Both speakers have given us a lot to think about. I'm wondering, Lina, whether you have a question for Beth in response to what she's just been saying.
Sure, Helen. Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much, Beth. I was drawn also to that concept of motherhood and the way it's been used, partly because it's quite a new concept the way we use it today. Again, it's kind of Victorian mostly. If we go earlier than in the medieval ages, mothering was primarily the sphere of monks and nuns. They would be using language of mothering and talking about their spiritual sons and daughters and so on. And on the other hand, the actual practice of mothering by women, again, was much more complex with wet nurses and so on. So again, we've inherited this very narrow sort of imagery of mother-child relationship as the epitome of pure love and so on. And I wonder whether if you have thought a bit further about how subverting or enlarging that concept, but also subverting, thinking about fecundity in different ways can help us all, those who are mothers biologically and those who are not, men and women alike as well.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? There's the kind of concept of generativity that often appears if you look at work on motherhood, and kind of this idea of kind of creating in a more general term, and needing to kind of reclaim some of what that looks like, and I think that would be one of the things. I also think there's some really interesting work coming out of womanist theology that talks about reclaiming the salvation as being brought into community, and so salvation isn't about kind of, you know, sort of the sacrifice of the cross, but about the being kind of reincorporated into a body which will help and enable, and the concept of allo mothering being brought into because mothering has always been a working motherhood. This has been a necessary thing that the community is relied upon to deliver the work of parenting, and I think that churches are uniquely placed actually to be that, you know, we use family, but I think you know, actually we do have multi-generational churches, and I think, you know, actually to see, is there a way of sharing the work, and in what ways might that be done in a really creative and interesting way? One of the greatest experience I've had as a mother in ministry has been when a guy in his 40s came up to me and said to me, I want to volunteer to look after your kid when you are at the front, because there is going to be a load of women who are going to offer that for you, but I also want to volunteer because I just think I would like us to model something different, and that was one of the huge graces of, I mean, it enabled me to do it because Kevin was absolutely beloved by Theo, so I think there is something as well about kind of, you know, maybe looking at kind of how the church in general terms looks after its children, and kind of, yeah, looking at it that way.